Welcome to an online event of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists and the American Scientific Affiliation. My name is Brian Greuel, and I'm president of the ACB. Tonight, we are delighted to have Dr. Katharine Hayhoe as our guest speaker. Dr. Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist who studies climate change, one of the most pressing issues facing humanity today. But she may be best known to many because of how she's bridging the broad, deep gap between scientists and Christians. Work she does primarily because she's a Christian herself. She's been named by Christianity Today as one of their 50 women to watch, and by Time magazine as one of their 100 most influential people. The United Nations named her as a champion of the earth. Katharine is also a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation. She serves as the World Evangelical Alliance's climate ambassador and as a science advisor to organizations from Young Evangelicals for Climate Action to the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. She's the author of the book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. She has a weekly newsletter called Talking Climate and has hosted the PBS digital series Global Weirding, Climate, Politics, and Religion, which is available on YouTube. Her TED Talk, entitled The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change, Talk About It, has had more than 4 million views. She is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a distinguished professor and chair at Texas Tech University. Tonight, Katharine will speak to us about Christians, climate, and our culture around the world. Katharine, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Brian. It is a pleasure to be with you all here today. There are so many people from all over. And as you could see from the chat, I'm going to be using an interactive tool to ask you some questions and then have you ask me questions as we go along. And with this interactive tool, you can click on the link that I put in the chat. All right, so when you do that, you will get to my first question to you, which a lot of you have already answered, which is, where are you joining from? Now, for those who don't know, I am Canadian, so I feel it very keenly that this map does not have the provinces marked on it, but I see that many of you from Southern Ontario, from Quebec, from British Columbia have already figured that out, and you have already put in where you are north of the border. I am from Toronto myself. I live in Texas. I see there's a few other people joining us from Texas, and this is great. It looks like we have great representation pretty much across the entire continent. And of course, if you're somewhere else on the other side, because we are meeting virtually, you can just put a dot there and we'll assume that you're in that direction or that direction as well. All right. Excellent. Lots of Canadians. Welcome. Lots of Americans as well. Looks like we have somebody joining from the Caribbean too. All right. So now I have another question to ask you. And this next question I'm going to ask you is one that was top of mind for most people yesterday, I should say. Top of mind for most people yesterday, and pretty much all that everybody I was talking to today was talking about. So my next question to you is, did you see the eclipse? Answer number one is yes, you had clear skies and you saw the whole thing. Mostly the clouds parted so you could see some of it. You know you were totally clouded over. And then there's a few people who are legitimately saying, what eclipse? Well, if you weren't in a line all the way from Toronto, diagonal across the US, right through Dallas. I like that because I'm from Toronto, I live in Dallas. So it was a line directly across North America from Toronto to Dallas, and that was the totality. So I saw it actually right from where I live, but my parents who live in Toronto came down to visit, and my son and my dad are really into astronomy and astrophotography. So when the forecast didn't look so good for Dallas yesterday, they actually got in the car and drove to Arkansas and got totally clear skies. But I personally would answer B. We had a really good view. There were a few clouds at some time, but we did see that totality, which was amazing. All right. So now you have the hang of how this works. Okay. So now I have another question for you. I'm just curious to know more about who you are. So if you don't mind telling me, Who are you? Are you a student? Students always answer first. Are you early career, mid career, late career, retired, doing something else, or alternatively, just living your best life, whatever that is? All right, it looks like we have a big retired contingent, 42% retired, 25% late career, and then we've got about 20% early to mid career, and then we've got about 14% students. Well, I'm doing something else. That's good. Some doing something else is popping up there too. All right. Oh, and somebody is living their best life. We all want to know how you're doing that. So if you have any secrets, feel free to put them in the chat. All right. It looks like we are, oh, okay. So 37% retired, about a third retired, 20% late career, 20% early and mid-career, and then we have students and other. Okay. So now the questions are getting harder. This next question, I want you to answer with a word. And if you're just catching up, if you're just joining us, you can figure out how to do this by using your phone and taking a picture of the QR code in the top right-hand side of the screen. Or if you go to the chat, Dana, if you don't mind just putting that link in the chat one more time, you can go to the chat and click on the chat on your computer if you're joining by computer, and you can join that way. If you're listening to the recording, I'm very sorry. This is not going to work for you. You just have to sit back and enjoy. This is only available interactively live. Okay, so the next question I have for you is more difficult because you need to answer with a word. Any word, but only one word. Not two words, just one word. And the next question I have for you is, in one word, what do you work on? If you could describe what you do in one word, what would it be? What do you work on? Okay. I see somebody cheated data visualization. That works though. And you can see why I asked this is because this is a Wordle. And so the more people who answer the same word, the bigger those words are. And so this gives us this amazing picture of who's here and what do we do, which I love. Okay, let's see what we've got. This is great. We've got so many responses. And I should just remind you, if you're listening in a group, you can do this too. Anybody can do it as long as you are listening live. All right. So it looks like we have education is really coming out strongly, as is climate and ecology. We also have justice and ministry. We have people who do chemistry and technology, psychology, mentoring and earthkeeping. I like that. Molecules and biology and research, language patents, quantum, homelessness, souls. That's a good one. This is an amazing, you know what? I can't say for sure, but I think this is a strong contender for the most diverse audience. This is an incredible variety of things that people work on. All right. So now, as we go along, I might ask you another question or two, and I'm also going to use this to collect your questions. So about a third of the way through the presentation, I'll open this up for your questions. And why I love using this tool to collect your questions is because you can see all the other questions other people are using, and you can upvote the questions you most like, because we have 143 people on this webinar right now. And I know a lot of people have questions. We don't have time to answer all of them. So you're going to help me out by upvoting the questions that are most important, but we will get to that in a bit. All right. So I wanted to begin here by actually talking a little bit about history. Now, I know we're going to get on to biology, biodiversity, and climate, which is what I do. But really, what I do is because of our history. So, starting back in human history, looking at our population, we can see that our population has grown exponentially over just the last 100, 200 years. If we look at our lifespan, we can see that our lifespan has doubled in what was 200 years ago, one of the most developed and industrialized countries in the world. 200 years ago in the UK, average life expectancy at birth was 40 years. Now, I'm not going to go to another poll and ask people how many people are over the age of 40. I am over the age of 40, and I would bet that more than half of us here are also over the age of 40. So 200 years ago, that was the average lifespan. Imagine if your life ended at 40, how many experiences you would miss. You'd barely get into mid-career and you'd be done. Nowadays, average life expectancy is upwards of 80 years. That is twice as long. The average person is living twice as long as they were before. And the number one reason for this incredibly extended life expectancy is the fact that over the last 200 years, we figured out how to get energy, not only from humans and animals, with just a tiny bit from wind and a tiny bit from water, as people have been doing for thousands of years. We figured out how to get our energy from fossil fuels, coal, and then gas, and then oil. And because we were able to extract so much energy from just digging it up from underground and burning it, that powered the Industrial Revolution, which in turn gave us things like refrigerators. Now, you might take your refrigerator for granted, but imagine what food was like if you didn't have storage. It was an all-day event. Imagine what your life is like without electricity, without mobility, without the scientific advances and the medical advances that came with the Industrial Revolution. I'm a climate scientist, but when I started to think about this, I realized I am profoundly grateful for these benefits. If I lived 200 years ago, first of all, I'd be dead. Second of all, before I died, I would never have achieved the level of education that I can as a woman today. I would never have been able to travel and experience things as I would have. My quality of life would have been much lower. I would have spent an entire day just doing laundry, and that was back when people only owned 2 or 3 outfits anyways. Our lives have been immeasurably improved by these fossil fuels. But what we have done is we have overused and overconsumed without any thought to the side effects of our choices. And as a result, we have created our own crises. The first crisis that we have created is the pollution crisis. Think about all of the pollution that we produce, our soil, our water, our air. Just speaking of that pollution, we've known for a number of years that 1 in 6 people around the world die from pollution, mostly air pollution. Air pollution kills millions of people every year around the world. In fact, air pollution from burning fossil fuels alone kills more people every year than the COVID pandemic did in the first year of the pandemic. But every year. Is that not mind-blowing? How is that not a headline? In the United States, a lot of those deaths occur outside the United States where people don't have the air quality standards that we do in Canada and the United States. But even in places like the US, coal-fired power plants alone killed almost 500,000 people. So the pollution crisis is real. It is affecting people's health directly today, and not just people, but that of nature that surrounds us. But that's not the only crisis we've created. By humans expanding across the planet, going from, hundreds of millions to 8 billion in just 200 years, we have taken up more and more space, not just for ourselves, but for our food, for the animals we grow, for all of the development that we create. And because of that, we are creating a biodiversity crisis. Just a few examples. The Living Planet Index tracks the abundance of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians across the globe. And whichever continent we are looking at, we see significant decreases. The biggest decreases because this is just in the last 50 years, the biggest decreases happened in Europe and North America before this index began. But since this index began, we've seen massive decreases in unique biodiversity hotspots like Southeast Asia, Central Africa, and Latin America and Caribbean. So over the last 50 years, these populations have fallen by 68%, and the primary cause is us. We're just using resources without any regard to waste and without any regard to its impact on nature. Now, often in the past, people would say, well, it's the economy or the environment, it's people or the planet. And to that, I would reply with a concept called, which many of you are familiar with, called ecosystem services. What are ecosystem services? In a nutshell, they are the services that nature provide to humans. What services do nature provide to humans? Everything. This is just one little example. Where do you think the oxygen you breathe comes from? Well, about half of it comes from photosynthesizers like phytoplankton and seaweed in the ocean. Where does the food we eat come from? How about the water we drink? What about the goods we use to make everything around us? It all comes from nature. Nature does not need us. We need it. We cannot we cannot survive without the nature that surrounds us. And the map I showed here, this is a really interesting map just to the United States, which shows the massive impact that humans have had, just for example, on one country. So what we're seeing here is yellow is area used to grow cows. Okay, maybe some sheep and goats, but mostly cows. That is just the yellow alone. Then the brown is what is used to grow crops. And not all those crops are used to eat. Some are used for energy, and a lot are used to feed cows. Gray is miscellaneous. Pink is urban, so pink is our cities. And then green is forest. The impact of humans is clear. And we've created this crisis ourselves. But then there's a third crisis. And this crisis is the climate crisis. And the reason why I work as a climate scientist primarily on the climate crisis, but as chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, we also tackle the biodiversity crisis at the same time, is because we cannot survive if we do not address these crises. It is not a case of people or the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. The question is, will we be? It's not a case of, the environment or the economy. Our entire economy is built on the resources the environment provides. So this is what I study. And these are the crises that we have created. And so although I am a climate scientist, I do a lot of work on the biodiversity crisis. I do a lot of work on the pollution crisis because many of them come from the same root cause, our unsustainable use of resources. Now, let me just pause here and note, often at this point, people will say, well, the problem is we have too many people. And it's all those, those people in low-income countries having too many babies, people will say, and that's creating this crisis. No, let me stop you right there. No. The richest 1% of people in the world, and believe me, the bar for richest 1% is actually quite low. It would surprise you. The richest 1% of people in the world are responsible for double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. Those of us living in Canada and North America, even if we're living relatively moderate, frugal lives, we would need 4 planets to provide all of our resources if everybody lived like us. So it is not as much a question of how many people we have, it is a question of the inequitable and wasteful distribution and use of resources. That is what has gotten us into this problem. And another way to put it is, we've been living as if we lived on a flat, infinite planet. There was always somewhere to go to get more, and there was always somewhere to put our waste where it wouldn't bother us. Now, of course, that's never actually been true, but that's the way we've been living. The reality is we live on a round planet, and what goes out here goes right around and comes back here. And on a round planet, there isn't infinite. There's not infinite space, there's not infinite land, there's not infinite places to put your pollution. What sustainability is learning how to live on a round planet. And if we don't learn how to live on a round planet, which as Christians we believe was our God-given planet, so God designed the round planet, and that's why we live on a round planet. If we don't figure out how to do it, we're the ones who are going to suffer, and much of nature along with us. So at this point, I want to stop and I want to go back to that tool. And if you're joining us late, just take a picture of the QR code up in the corner with your phone, or Dana, if you don't mind putting the link in the chat one more time, go to the chat and click on that link. I want to ask you another question, and you need to answer this question with one word, just like you did before. When I say climate change, how do you feel in one word? I'm not surprised. 2 years ago, I wrote a book called Saving Us. And when I started to speak to people about the book, it's not called Saving the Planet, it's called Saving Us. The very first talk I gave was to a group of mothers at a science museum in Utah. And I thought, I'm assuming that this is how people feel, but I'm not sure that they do. So I asked them, and actually, I should go find what their responses were and put it up here, because you couldn't tell the difference between what they said and what you said. And since then, I've asked the same question of medical professionals, climate scientists, students, architects, botanical artists, gardening clubs, Catholic nuns. And I haven't found a single group where I saw a statistically significantly different answer than what you've given me here. 90% at least negative words with concerned, frustrated, anxious, angry, worried, sad, overwhelmed, depressed, dominating. So if you feel this way, I want to tell you, first of all, and this is really important, if you feel this way, first of all, this is a rational response. The Association of Psychologists have met recently to talk about the rise in climate anxiety, and they said this is not a syndrome. This is not a mental health condition, because it is just a rational response. If you actually understand what we are doing, this is how we would feel. And believe me, most climate scientists would give you the same answers. I was just in a room of folks who do climate adaptation, about 200 of us, and we all had the same answer. Because as far back as we look in the history of this planet, we have never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. The planet has been warmer or cooler in the past, but it has never happened this fast, and we've never had 8 billion people on the planet when it was happening. So if you feel worried, anxious, and concerned, that is a rational response to what's happening. It means that you actually understand the magnitude and the importance of what's happening. The second thing, though, I want you to know is that you are not alone. This was a global survey that was done 2 years ago. The gray areas are countries that just weren't surveyed. The survey was 70% of the world's population, as represented by the colored countries. And any country where more than 60% of people said they were worried is pink. And as you can see, the only countries that are not pink are countries where people don't even know if they'll be able to, feed their families tomorrow, or if they'll wake up and have a safe place to live tomorrow. Everywhere else is pink to red. So if you're worried, it is a rational response, and you are not alone. Most people feel this way. In the US right now, 2/3 of people would say they're worried about climate change. In Canada, it's almost 80%. I live in Texas, where a survey last September found that 42% of registered Republican voters in Texas were worried about climate change. Over 90% of registered Democratic voters in Texas were also worried. But if we've gotten to the point where almost half of registered Republican voters in Texas are worried about climate change, we know that something is going on. And it's not only because it affects us. We know that climate change affects all of us, no matter where we live, anywhere around the world, but it doesn't affect us all equally. When we look at who's most affected, it's the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, whether that's in a different country on the other side of the world, or even in our own country. Back in 1990, 2/3 of the socioeconomic inequality around the world was between country. Now, post-COVID, 2/3 of the socioeconomic inequality around the world is within country. And the less resources people have, the less able they are to prepare, adapt, build resilience, and to cope with what happens when your home floods, what happens when your home insurance doubles or triples, what happens when food prices double, what happens when you have to evacuate, you don't have a car, or you're sick. The most vulnerable are the ones most affected by climate change. And this is science, but it speaks directly to our value systems. When we realize that climate change is the hole in the bucket, it takes poverty, hunger, lack of access to clean water, basic education, basic medical care, a safe place to live. It takes all of these things and it makes it worse. The US military refers to climate change as a threat multiplier. In other words, 9 times out of 10, it's not creating a new problem we've never had before. It's taking a problem we already have, poverty, inequity, hunger, disease, lack of access to resources, and making it worse. Now, this is what the science tells us. But how do we respond? That's not so much what's in our head, but what's in our heart. And for those of us who are Christians, those of us who base our value system on the Bible, I think this speaks directly to us. And I want to begin with the first book in the Bible and the first chapter in the first book, which is in Genesis, a verse that, if you grew up going to Sunday school, you're very familiar with this verse. God made human beings in his image, made them reflecting his nature. But whenever I heard this verse growing up, I didn't realize that there was a so that at the end. I didn't realize there was a reason that the Bible says that humans were created in God's image. And if you go on, what it says is we were created in God's image so that we can, and the Hebrew word is rada, so we can rada every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. Just think about that for a sec. The Bible says that we were humans, all humans were designed in God's image for a purpose to rada every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. Now, in the Old King James Version of the Bible, this was interpreted as have dominion over. In more modern translations, it's translated as have responsibility over. But rather than argue over the translation, let's just go to a different verse in the Bible that uses the same Hebrew word, and let's see how they apply it in context, because it's very illuminating. So you could do this with many different verses, but I think this one's very clear. It's a verse from the Psalms, and it's speaking of God as a ruler. And it says, may he rada, so you could say have dominion over, or you could say have responsibility from sea to sea. Why? To extract every penny of value from that land and then leave it a broken, smoking ruin? To pollute it, to destroy the nature and the wildlife? No. It says, may he rada, to what? To deliver the needy when he cries for help, the afflicted also, and him who has no helper, to have compassion on the poor and needy, and the lives of the needy he will save. So what does this tell you about the attitude that we are intended to have towards every living thing on this earth? To deliver the needy, to deliver the afflicted, to have compassion. This is what this word implies. And when we say living things, we often think that doesn't include humans, but are we not living things also? Living things include plants, animals, humans. We're all included in this verse in Genesis that we are called to rada and have compassion for each other, as well as for all other aspects of nature. So that's what brings me to the conclusion that caring about what happens to this physical world and to all the living things, including our sisters and our brothers who inhabit it, it is not somehow antithetical to who Christians are. In fact, if we take the Bible seriously, then we will recognize it's entirely consistent with who we are. And in fact, it is who God has made us. Isn't that a radical thought? God made us people who are people who can address the biodiversity crisis, who can address the climate crisis, who can address the pollution crisis. In fact, that is our God-given responsibility and the reason why we were created in God's image. It's a pretty radical thought. So this is why I became a climate scientist. I became a climate scientist not when I learned about the problem itself, but when I connected the dots between what I believed and why it mattered. And when I became a climate scientist, and through the many years I've been a climate scientist, almost 30 years now, if you can believe it, I've learned a number of things. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to share what I think are 6 of the most important things that I've learned with you. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up this to your questions. So as I go through the 6 things I've learned, at any point, if you have a question, you can just type it in here. This will be open the whole time. And I'll remind you to do it every once in a while. And you can also look at the questions other people have asked, and you can give it a thumbs up if you want me to answer that question. So as I go through these 6 things, we will have this open and you can put your questions in anytime. And then at the end, we'll have a short Q&A. All right. So what were the 6 things that I've learned in my almost 30 years as a climate scientist? So the first thing I learned is that although understanding the planet is as complex as trying to understand the human body, what's actually happening is very simple. We talked about the pollution crisis. When we produce waste and we just, let it go into the air, the water, the soil, it creates pollution. When we cut down forests, and when we turn grasslands into not just pastures, but when we turn them into paved areas, when we destroy wildlife, that creates the biodiversity crisis. And how do we create the climate crisis? Well, it's so simple that I can explain it with a few cartoons in less than 1 minute. Our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that keeps us the perfect temperature for life. The sun's energy shines down and goes through that blanket like a window. The earth absorbs the sun's energy and heats up, and then it gives off heat energy. How does a blanket keep you warm at night? Not an electric blanket, just a regular blanket. The regular blanket traps your body heat, and it keeps you just the right temperature at night. So this natural blanket of heat-trapping gases the planet has traps our body heat and keeps us over 30 degrees Fahrenheit, over 30 degrees Celsius, over 60 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than we would be otherwise. In fact, if we did not have this natural heat-trapping blanket, our planet would be a frozen ball of ice. So if this blanket is natural, which it is, and if it is responsible for the fact that we have life on Earth, which it is, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, that's almost 80% of the problem. And then by cutting down large areas of forest and expanding industrial agriculture, that's about 20% of the problem, we are wrapping an extra blanket around the Earth. Like I said, burning coal, gas, and oil, that's almost 80% of the problem. And then our waste, our deforestation, and our industrial agriculture, that's just over 20% of the problem. All of these extra heat-trapping gases are building up in the atmosphere where they're wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. And just like you would if someone snuck into your room at night and said, hey, they put an extra blanket over you, you'd wake up and you'd say, hey, I don't need this extra blanket. You'd be running a fever, you'd be heating up, you'd be sweating. That's exactly what's happening to our planet. That is climate change. The second thing I learned is that not only is this real and very simple to understand, it's very serious. Now, people might say, yeah, but you're just talking about a few degrees. Why does a few degrees matter? I mean, between the room I'm in and that room over there, it's more than a few degrees temperature difference. Well, over the time scale of human civilization on this planet, our planet's average temperature has been as stable as that of the human body. Over the course of a day, your body temperature goes up and down by a few tenths of a degree. Over the last 6,000 to 8,000 years of human civilization, our average temperature, we're not talking about the weather where you live, we're talking about the average temperature of the whole planet, has gone up and down by a few tenths of a degree. That is normal. But what happens if your body temperature goes up by 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit? You feel achy. You take some Tylenol. You wonder what you ate. You wonder who breathed on you. You might take a COVID test. You might go to the doctor. You're not feeling so well. And the average temperature of our planet has increased by 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 100 years. It's feeling achy. It's not doing so well. We're feeling some symptoms. There's almost an exact analogy between the safe variation of our body temperature and the safe variation of our planet's average temperature for human civilization on this planet. As I mentioned earlier, we've never seen things changing this fast. And in fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which produces these big reports every 6 to 7 years, the last report found that the warming that we are seeing is unprecedented in our experience. We humans have never seen it happen this fast. Often people refer to this issue as global warming because as scientists, we use the average temperature of the planet to track just how quickly it's happening. But for those of us, where we live, we don't measure the average temperature of the planet. What we see is more like what I call global weirding. Where did this term come from? Well, a number of years ago, I was standing in line at church, waiting to pick up my son from Sunday school. And the man standing in front of me said, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" I said, "Well, sure. We're standing in line. It's not like we're going anywhere." And he said, "Do you feel like our weather has gotten weirder?" And now this was in Lubbock, Texas, which just a year or two earlier had won the Weather Channel's competition for the wildest weather in the country. Lubbock, Texas beat out Fargo, North Dakota, Caribou, Maine, and Fairbanks, Alaska for the wildest weather. So, anywhere you live, the weather might be like this. If you live in Lubbock, Texas, the weather's like this. So here we are in Lubbock, Texas, and he said, "Do you feel like the weather's gotten weirder?" And I said, "Well, I look at the data, and yes, I think that might be a good way to describe it. Our heat waves are starting earlier and lasting longer. Our droughts are stronger. Our heavy rainfall is more intense. Our hurricanes are stronger and dropping more rain. And we know wildfires are burning greater area too. In fact, in Texas just this year, we had the largest wildfire on record so far." And he said, "I knew it." He said, "I've lived here for 30 years and I knew that something was different." So nowadays, when I ask people, "Do you feel like the weather's getting weirder?" Everywhere I go, if I ask people this question, everybody says yes. And the way I think about it is, it's as if we have a pair of natural weather dice. And wherever we live, we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. A heat wave, a drought, a storm, a flood, a wildfire. If you live in Lubbock, Texas, you already have 3 6s on your dice naturally. But as the planet gets warmer decade by decade, it's like it's sneaking in and taking another of these numbers and turning it into another 6 and another 6 and maybe even a 7. And so then people are saying, "Well, we just had 3 500-year flood events in 3 years in Houston, Texas. How could that happen?" That's global weirding or climate change loading the weather dice against us. We've always had heat waves, but the heat waves are getting longer and stronger, and the heat wave season is longer. We've always had wildfires, and in fact, most wildfires in the lower 48 states are due to accidental human ignition. About 7% are arson. Most are accidental human ignition. Up in Canada and Alaska, most of the wildfires begin by lightning. But when that lightning strikes, or when that accidental match drops, imagine if it drops into a pile of green, wet wood. What happens? Not much. And then imagine it drops into a pile of bone-dry kindling that has been baking in extreme heat and drought for weeks. What happens? A conflagration. That's the difference between with or without climate change. And so as a result, we're seeing record areas burned in Canada last year, and we still have fires smoldering in Canada through the winter, waiting for spring to break out again. The orange skies over Ontario and Quebec and upstate New York last year. Larger wildfires. Droughts are lasting longer and more intense. We don't see any more frequent hurricanes. The factors that contribute to hurricane formation, as the world gets warmer, some of them are getting more frequent and some of them are getting less frequent. So they balance each other out, and the number of hurricanes we're seeing is about the same. But hurricanes are powered by warm ocean water. In fact, they're actually sort of plugged into the ocean. And remember I said that we're wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, trapping all this heat inside the climate system? Over 90% of that heat is going into the ocean. So everything we see happening up here, that is just a few percentages of the heat. Most of it's going into the ocean, where it is fueling stronger storms. So we're seeing the same number of hurricanes, but they are much stronger, they are bigger, and they are dropping a lot more rain than they used to. We're seeing that atmospheric rivers, if you live on the West Coast in BC or California, you know what these are. Atmospheric rivers are stronger and they're dumping more rain. And even just heavy rainfall is getting more frequent because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along, as it always does, there's more water vapor for it to sweep up and dump on us. In the United States, back in the 1980s, there was $1 billion weather and climate disaster on average every 4 months. So about 3 a year. Accounting for how the value of the dollar has changed over time, by the 2010s, there was one every 2.8 weeks, and last year there was one every 1.8 weeks. Not only that, but we are being able to, as scientists, start to put numbers on how much worse climate change made a specific event, how much it was loading the dice against us, whether it happened in New York or whether it happened in Pakistan. We're able to say, the floods in Germany, 7 times more likely. The Pacific Northwest and British Columbia heat wave in June of 2021, 150 times more likely. The massive drought in Syria right now would not even have been a drought if it weren't being supersized by climate change. Climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. Remember, I pointed out this map before showing who's most vulnerable, those who've contributed the least to the problem. And we see that we're experiencing stronger droughts, more intense heat waves, larger wildfires, more dangerous hurricanes. But when they hit a country like Bangladesh, it puts millions at risk and leaves them homeless. When a hurricane hits North Carolina versus Haiti, the same hurricane can cause orders of magnitude more damages in Haiti because they lack the infrastructure. They already have cholera in their water. They have no insurance, no National Guard, no way for people to get food. And like I just mentioned in Syria, back in 2014, there was a drought in Texas just before that and a drought in Syria just after that was the same intensity. The drought in Texas led to about $8 billion in crop losses and agricultural losses. But the drought in Syria drove more than half the farming population off their land into the cities, 90% unemployment, refugee crises, orders of magnitude more impacts. As the Prime Minister of Dominica said, one of the islands that was devastated in the 2017 hurricane season, he said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have lived. So I learned that climate change is understanding what's happening is simple, but it's very serious. And what I also learned as a scientist is the science is very old. Did you know how long we've known about this extra blanket that we're wrapping around the planet? Well, I'll tell you in a minute. But first of all, I wanted to highlight the fact that denial of this science only began 30 years ago. We've known since the 1800s that digging up and burning coal and gas and oil would produce heat-trapping gases that wrap an extra blanket around the planet. But it wasn't until the 1990s that people started to say, are you sure it's just not a natural cycle or the sun of volcanoes? Or aren't you climate scientists just making it up to line your pockets? I had somebody just today say exactly that to me. You're just making it up to line your pockets. Being the president of a large company that benefited from the oil and gas economy in Alberta. So if you're interested in knowing more, there's 2 really good books. One focuses more on the US and the other focuses more on Canada. Merchants of Doubt for the US, Petroleum Papers for Canada, but they both explain where denial came from. And in a nutshell, it did not come from the science. We have very solid answers for the most common objections. When people say, isn't it the sun or natural cycles of volcanoes? We know that it isn't because we've asked those questions ourselves many decades ago. In fact, so long ago, it was before I became a climate scientist. And that's how we know it is not these natural factors causing climate change. We know that it's not the sun causing our warming because the sun's energy's been going down the last 50 or 60 years, not up. If the sun were responsible for our current change, we'd be getting gradually cooler, not warmer. We know that it isn't natural cycles because natural cycles, they just move heat around the Earth system from north to south or east to west or ocean to atmosphere and back again. So if one part of the world is getting warmer while the other part gets cooler, that's a natural cycle. But you can't have the whole world getting warmer due to a natural cycle because that would violate conservation of energy. And then people say, well, isn't it true that one volcanic eruption produces more pollution than people do in a year or 10 years or 30 years? No, not at all. In fact, volcanic eruptions primarily produce what we call sulfate aerosols. Those are small droplets that if they get high up enough in the atmosphere, they reflect the sun's energy back to space, cooling the Earth. A big volcanic eruption will temporarily cool the Earth for anywhere from a couple of weeks up to maybe a year. If you look at all the geologic activity around the whole Earth, not just volcanoes, but all the smelly gases, if you've ever been to Yellowstone or some areas of Sicily, all the smelly gases you can smell coming up. Some of those are heat trapping gases. Add up all that around the world, it produces the same amount of heat trapping gases as 3 medium-sized US states alone. All the natural factors we've looked at, they're off the hook. They have an alibi. It's us. But here's the thing. When we respond to these sciencey sounding objections with more science, we miss the point of the objections. If people really thought it was the sun or natural cycles or volcanoes, or they really thought scientists were lining their pockets to create this faux crises, they would have brought these up back in the 1850s when scientists were first publishing this research. They would have brought it up in the 1930s when scientists were first detecting a human signal in the warming of the planet. They would have brought it up in the 1960s when scientists were warning a US president, Lyndon B. Johnson, of the dangers of climate change. Were any of these objections voiced in the 1850s, the 1930s, or the 1960s? No, they were not. These objections were not voiced at all until when? Until climate change moved from being a future issue to being a present issue. Why? Because as long as it's a future issue, we don't have to do anything about it. If it's a future issue, scientists can do whatever they want and say whatever they want. But if it is a future issue, we don't have to do anything. But by the 1980s, climate change was moving from being a future issue to being a now issue. There was a massive heat wave in the 1988. Jim Hansen from NASA testified to Congress in 1988. In 1990, the first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report was published, and it was so long ago that this is the grainiest, the most highest resolution image I could find, right here in the middle. Time magazine talked about it on their cover. So by the 1980s and 90s, this issue was moving from future to present. And if it was a present issue, what does that mean? It means we have to do something about it. And remember, where does almost 80% of this extra blanket come from? Comes from burning coal and gas and oil. In the 1990s, if you looked at the richest companies in the world, just about every company on that richest companies list made its money from digging up, processing, selling, or making things that burn fossil fuels. And those companies had a playbook. It came directly from the tobacco industry. And so if you go back to read Merchants of Doubt or the Petroleum Papers, it tells you how those companies picked up the playbook from the tobacco company, and they decide to delay action as long as possible through saying, are we sure? Maybe we need to study it some more. Those scientists aren't credible. They're just in it for the money. Maybe we just need to look at some other factors, or isn't more CO2 good? It's plant food after all, isn't it? The point is not to actually question the science, because if it was, it would have come up in the 1850s, the 1930s, and the 1960s. The point is to prevent action. And to that end, any excuse will do. It can be science-y. It's just a natural cycle. It's cold outside. It can be religiously. God's in control, so why does this matter? Well, in Genesis 1, it says God gave humans responsibility. It doesn't matter what it is. If you address one, another one will pop right up because we're not addressing the real issues. And so what I've learned is that the real issues here are not lack of education. They are not lack of intelligence. They are not actual doubts with the science. The real issues are issues that relate much more directly to our heart than to our head. These days, we are basing our identity much more on what the Apostle Paul calls the flesh. We are basing our identity on our politics, on our ideology. And based on what our politics or our ideology says, we are making decisions that in some cases actually contradict the truth of what God's creation is telling us. And the Bible speaks directly to this. The Apostle Paul says, according to the flesh, this is who I was. I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews according to the flesh. But he says, I count it all but dung in exchange for knowing the truth of what Christ has done for me and who I am. So we are basing our identities on politics, on ideology. And today in the United States, the number one predictor of whether people agree with facts we've known since the 1800s, climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, the number one predictor is simply where people fall on the political spectrum. And the last time there was an election in Canada, if you compared the map of who voted for which party in Canada by riding, we call them ridings in Canada, in case you didn't know. If you compared the map of who voted for what in Canada with a map of is climate change real, they were basically, the correlation was over 90%. Is a thermometer red, blue, green, or orange? No. Does a hurricane knock on the door of your house and say, excuse me, are you a registered Democrat or Republican voter before it rips the roof off your house and floods your basement? No. Does a wildfire ask who you voted for in the last election before it chokes your lungs? Absolutely not. This is not a political issue. The solutions are, but the science isn't. We have to agree it's real, it's us, it's serious, but then let's argue over the solutions, because I don't think anybody has a perfect one, but there's a lot of good ones that we could agree on. And this gets to the second one. Solution aversion. People say, well, I'm afraid that if we fix this thing, it will cause me to experience loss. And I'm sorry to say, many environmentalists actually feed solution aversion by saying all the solutions are about taking away your car, your truck, your food, your ability to travel, your ability to do your job, your ability to have children even. So many of these solutions are couched in terms of loss. But as we'll get to, I believe that most of these solutions will benefit us and others. And when we realize who's suffering, I ask myself, what is solution aversion? I don't want to fix this because I don't like how it would affect my life. What is that other than a failure to love our neighbor as ourselves when our neighbors are already suffering the impacts? So this, as you can see, we're going deeper and deeper here. This is something really, really important that I feel like I've learned. And that is why who you are and who I am, we're exactly the right people, and we're in exactly the right place to work on this issue, to talk about this issue, to advocate for this issue. All right, moving on to number 4. Now remember, we're halfway through here, and I'm taking your questions. So don't forget, if you want to put your questions in the chat there, we will be getting to those shortly. 4th, picking up on this, what are the climate and the pollution and the biodiversity crises other than a failure to love? To love God's creation, to love God, and to love each other. Because these crises are literally affecting the air we breathe. I mentioned earlier that millions of people die every year just from breathing in the air pollution from burning fossil fuels alone. It's affecting the food we eat. Since the 1980s, we've been losing $5 billion worth of crops every year due to climate change alone, most of those in the poorest parts of the world where people cannot afford to feed their families. It's affecting the water we drink. It's affecting our buildings and roads and systems and cities, all of which were built for a planet that doesn't exist anymore. Did you know that in many places in the US and in Canada, our insurance rates are doubling? I talked to a colleague in Florida just a few weeks ago. Her home insurance went from $2,000 to $5,000 in 1 year. We just got a homeowners association notice saying that our homeowners association fees were going to go up by 50%. I looked at it. The number one reason, our insurance rates increased. It's happening in Canada. It's happening in Louisiana. It's happening in Florida and Texas. It's happening in California. Some places people can't even get insurance anymore because the insurance companies are crunching the numbers and they're like, it's not even worth it. Like I said, it is not about saving the planet. The planet itself will be orbiting the sun long after you and I are gone. It is about saving us. And when I say us, I mean all of us living things that share this home. So that's number 4. But now, number 5, how do we get people to care about this? How do we get people to care? Because I care and you care, but how do we get anybody else to care? Look at the year we just had, filled with disasters. Hot tub temperature ocean water off the coast of Florida, the worst wildfire season on record in Canada and Hawaii and the Canary Islands and Greece. The hottest year on record, the hottest months on record. Often people say if this doesn't catalyze climate change, nothing will. Excuse the pun. So often we feel like most of us, I'm worried, most of you are worried, but most people aren't worried because they don't want to talk about it. And so if they don't talk about it, if they're not worried, what do we need to do? We need to tell them how bad it is. So climate changes and we get worried and we tell people it's bad. We share very truthful, scary information with them. But what happens? Nothing. People just push it off even more and inaction results. Why? Well, it turns out that this is not the way our brains are wired to work. According to the neuroscience, Tali Sharot is a neuroscientist who wrote a very good book called The Influential Mind. She said, fear and anxiety, and she's not talking about climate change. She's just talking about our brain. Fear and anxiety, according to neuroscience, cause us humans to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. And what's really interesting to me is that the Bible says the same thing. One of my favorite verses is in 2 Timothy, where the Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy, he was mentoring, and he says, God has not given us a spirit of fear. How often do we hear the issue of climate change or the issue of politics talked about through a lens of fear? It's a litmus test. If our dominant response or emotion is fear, it says God has not given us that spirit. What has God given us? Well, what does fear do? It paralyzes us. Right? That's just what it says back here. Fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up. So what Apostle Paul says to Timothy is, God has given us a spirit of power. What does that mean? Well, if you're empowered, it means you can act. It's the opposite of being paralyzed. God has given us, number one, the ability to act. Number two, out of love, which means we are thinking of others, not just ourselves. And as a scientist, I love the last one, a sound mind, to make good decisions using the brain that he gave us. This is what both the Bible and neuroscience says, is that this is not the way to motivate us to change. And when we look at the data, the public opinion data, it turns out that this is not what we look like anymore. Remember that map of the world I showed you where most of the areas were pink? In the US and in Canada and in most in Western Europe, this is what we look like. We have a small group that isn't worried because they haven't connected how climate change is affecting the people and places and things they love yet. When they do, I'm pretty sure they'll move over to the blue. We have a large group of blue people who are worried, but they don't know what to do. 50% of people in the US feel helpless and don't know what to do. And then we have a small group that are activated, 8% in the US. So what is the goal here? Is the goal to move the yellow from the blue? Or yellow to the blue, or is the goal to move the blue to the green? In my opinion, it's more important to move the blue to the green. People who are already worried, already feel hopeless and don't know where to start, are not activated. More information about ice sheets and sea level rise and polar bears is not going to do it. Those are the headlines that spread the fastest on social media, but a new study that just came out last week showed that those types of news are the absolute worst. Yes, the scientific authors literally said the absolute worst at getting people out to actually do anything. We click and we share, but we don't do anything. So let's go back to the neuroscience. Climate changes and we get worried. What does the neuroscience say we should be doing at this point? Rather than loading up on the scary information and facts about future scenarios and polar bears and ice sheets, all the stuff that we have in our head, what the neuroscience says is we have to engage our heart and our hands. And I believe the Bible talks a lot about that too, right? How do we do that? By sharing how climate change is affecting the people, places, and things we love. And unless you're a polar bear, that's not it. So I have a weekly newsletter where I talk about how climate change affects our food, how it affects our health, how it affects the sports that we love, how it affects our kids, how it affects our gardens. Make the head to heart connection, but don't stop there. We have to make the heart to hands connection. What do solutions look like? And it turns out that when we talk about the heart and the hands, people feel empowered, and that's when action results, because that's what the neuroscience says our brains are wired to do. The human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not with avoiding harm. So, and I promise you, she's not talking about climate change. She's just talking about the brain. Reframe your message so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. Isn't that amazing? And when it comes to climate solutions, like I said, I believe we have good news to share. Climate solutions give us air that is cleaner, not dirtier. They protect us from disasters. They improve our health. They provide energy that's more affordable, not less. Solar is the cheapest form of electricity humans have ever known. They reduce our inequalities. They create healthier ecosystems and food systems. They give us a world that's better than the one we have today, not worse. Who's on board with these solutions? Is anybody actually doing anything? Yes. Entire countries are on board. Cities are on board. I worked with the city of Houston and Chicago myself. Companies are on board, not just Patagonia, but other companies that you might have heard of. Universities and seminaries. The Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary has the largest solar array in the city of Elkhart in Northwest Indiana. If you're from Indiana, you know where that is. Many churches are on board, of all denominations, all around the world. Many young people are on board. Mothers are on board. Senior citizens are on board. If you're watching the news today, you heard that senior citizens in Switzerland took their country to the European Court of Human Rights, and they won their appeal by saying their country isn't doing enough to protect them and their families against climate change. When we look at these solutions, I love particularly knowing how nature can help. How working with nature rather than against nature, how restoring nature to our cities, to our coastlines can help with floods and heat and hurricanes, as well as saving energy costs. Greening low-income neighborhoods, which can be up to 15 degrees hotter during a heat wave than a high-income neighborhood in the same city. Greening those neighborhoods can first of all save lives. It can reduce people's power bills. The trees filter air, reducing air pollution. The green space provides a place for water to go when it rains so it doesn't flood. It improves people's physical and mental health by being able to spend time outdoors. Oh, and those trees take up carbon too. It's like the icing on the cake. There's so many solutions that have so many benefits. So when people start learning more about solutions, and in my newsletter every week, I share solutions, a new solution every single week. When we find out what's happening, we just say, well, why not? Why aren't we doing this everywhere? And to a certain extent, we are. Renewable energy is going quickly around the world in places where people don't have any energy at all, as well as on many of our churches right here. So what can we do as Christians? I believe that we can act lovingly by considering the needs of those who live in poverty and hunger right here, as well as on the other side of the world, and helping them with their needs today as well as their needs tomorrow. I believe that we can be wise with our resources. I love the fact that there's organizations like Colby May runs, where Colby has a business degree from my university and a divinity degree. And he combined those to help churches, schools, Christian colleges reduce their energy use, save money, use that money to care for others, and reduce their heat trapping gas emissions too. I love the fact that there's climate stewards that helps each of us act individually to reduce our own emissions and invest in other people's lives. So now I'm getting to the last question, and you are almost out of time to put your questions in. You have 2 more minutes to get your questions in there, or just look at the questions other people have asked and give a thumbs up to the ones that you most want answered, okay? So 2 more minutes to get your questions in there and to upvote the ones that you want. So I know you're going to have divided attention here. You'll be looking at some of those questions and listening to me, but do listen to these last 2 minutes because they're very important. This is the last question, which is where do we go from here? This is all fine at a higher level, but me, what do I do next? This is actually, I would say, the number one question I get these days is what do I do? Not a church, not an organization, not a city, not a country. What do I do? Well, like I said, most people agree this thing is real. But this is a map of the US, but for Canada, we're very similar. Most people agree it's real, but when they ask people, do you ever talk about it? Most people say no. And when I saw these maps, it really blew my mind. Because, and you might say, well, is this true globally? Yes. Do you worry about climate change globally? We saw this before. Do you ever talk about it? Look at that. Now, what's very interesting here? People often say, well, I'm just one person. What can I do? I think, I can't prove, but I think that you can see the influence of one small person on this map. One of the darkest color countries here is the country of Sweden, which is home to a young girl called Greta Thunberg. And I am pretty convinced that you can see the impact of one person taking a piece of white cardboard and painting a "School Strike for Climate" sign on it and going and sit outside a building, kick-starting conversations that are now taking place in businesses, in homes, in churches, in schools, in communities around Europe. And we start to see some of those happening here too. So never think that one person is not enough. I think this map is evidence that one person is enough. Now, talking, you might say, sounds so simple. Like, don't you want me to go out and change my light bulbs or get a plug-in car or get solar panels? Sure. But the most effective thing that you can do has nothing to do with your carbon footprint. As Bill McKibben says, who is somebody who also approaches this from a very faith-based perspective, Bill says, the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. What does he mean by that? He means that by engaging with others, we can change who we see ourselves as, what people around us think, our social norms, our sense of whether we can get something done or not. That's what efficacy means, and our ability and willingness to act. Talking is the first step that we often take for granted, so much so that we don't do it. It is the kickstarter or the catalyst to action. If we don't talk about something, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it? So I looked back in history. Remember, I began this with history? I want to end with history. I looked back in history when I was writing an essay for Time magazine a couple of years ago when the latest IPCC report came out about where do we find our hope in the face of such dire scientific facts. And I said, what we see is that time and time again, we find our hope in action. Our society has changed before, and when it did, it was not because a president or a prime minister or a CEO or a celebrity or a big, rich, famous person decided it had to. Again and again, we see that change did not begin when the King of England woke up one morning and said, oh, we should end slavery. That didn't happen. It didn't begin when the president of the United States, finished his dinner and said, well, dear, I think we should give women the vote. That didn't happen. It didn't happen when the National Party of South Africa decided, oh, it's Friday, we should just end apartheid. No. When did the massive societal change that ended slavery, got women the vote, ended apartheid, and more, when did that change begin? With who and how? It began with very ordinary people, many of them people of faith, but not of any particular power or wealth or fame, who decided the world could and should be different. We know a few of those names, William Wilberforce, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela. But there are so many more whose names we don't know, yet we live in their shadow today. They shared and supported and fought for a vision of a better world. They had the courage of their convictions. And what did they do? Abolitionists boycotted sugar, but they used their voices. You see what I mean? Your carbon footprint, yes, do something about it to be consistent with who we are and what we're saying. But how do we affect societal change? Our voice is the most powerful thing we have. And we are the people who changed the world before. And that's why I know that we're the people who can do it again. So when we look around, we realize climate action is not a giant boulder sitting at the top of a hill with only one or two hands on it. When we look around, we see that there's so many people pushing that giant boulder down the hill. If I had my hand and if I use my voice to encourage people I know, my church, my organization, my company, my school to add theirs, it will go faster. And not only that, it's not only a human responsibility, But as Christians, we believe that caring about God's creation, which includes the people and the other living things that are already being affected by climate change today, it is a genuine expression of our faith. It's a faithful acceptance of our responsibility, and it's a true expression of God's love. To end with the words of the Apostle Paul, the only thing that counts is when our faith expresses itself through love. Or, in the version of the Bible they put on road signs in Texas, that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, signed God. So that's why often when I speak about climate change, the title I use is this: Loving Our Global Neighbor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katharine, for that informative and really thought-provoking presentation. The one that looks right now to be the most popular question is the one about how did the issue of climate change become so politicized?
Yes. And I just want to assure everybody, let me just pin myself here. I will just assure you, you can still see the questions if you're looking at it on your device. We won't have to go over because I'm very good at answering lots of questions. And what I'm going to do too for your questions, because these are such good questions, and what I want to do is I want to give you a short answer, but I also want to give you, in many cases, a resource where you can learn more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a short answer to as many of these questions as I can. I think I can get through quite a few. Thank you for upvoting. This is a huge help. But then I'm also going to put a resource in the chat. So if you want to learn more, it will tell you. And so, word of God. For the very first question, which is how did this get so politicized? There's two really good books I recommended to you. The two books I recommended to you were Merchants of Doubt, and the Petroleum Papers. But there is also a really excellent article called How Fossil Fuel Money Made Climate Change Denial the Word of God. And it draws the lines directly to the faith community. You can also get this information from Mark Noll's really good book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which shows how science and issues became politicized in the United States and how religion became politicized as well. So in a nutshell, what happened, I mentioned, is all through over 150 years of science, it wasn't politicized. It didn't become politicized until when? Until people realized we had to do something about it. And then the richest companies in the world figured, oh, what can we do? We need to delay action as long as possible. How do you delay action? You make the issue politicized. So they deliberately set out to make it politicized. And unfortunately, at that time, we were already seeing an alignment of faith with one half of the political spectrum. It had already begun over the issue of abortion, over the issue of desegregating schools. That had already begun in the 70s and 80s. So Christians were already heading towards one end of the political spectrum. And along came the issue of climate change. A large amount of money was pushing it towards that end of the spectrum, including donations to Christian organizations to put out climate denial information from trusted sources in our community. And as a result, today, we find that white evangelical Protestants and white Catholics are at the bottom of the list of those least concerned about climate change. Now, ironically, Hispanic Catholics are at the top. And you might say, well, don't they have the same Pope? Yes. It turns out researchers have shown that that is a correlation, not causation. It is not where we go to church that is causing this issue. It is our political affiliation and basically identifying ourselves not as children of God, but rather according to the flesh. So that's the short answer, but the long answer is those resources right there, and I encourage you to check them out because they are really, really interesting. Okay. People in my life say there's no infrastructure to switch to sustainable energy, and if everybody gets an electric car, the system won't be able to produce the energy we need. This is an excuse. How do I know? Because the University of California, Berkeley, who has a lot of very smart people, studied what would happen if we switched to electric vehicles and if we electrified our homes with heat pumps and things like that. And they found that we can do it no problem. And then the Nature Conservancy said, well, won't it take up too much land? So we just produced a report last year that showed if we just use wasteland, old mining areas, roadsides, contaminated land, we have more than enough land for all the solar and wind energy we need. 20 years ago, these were valid reasons, But today in 2024, they're just excuses. How do I respond to the dismissive who says it's in God's hands? I definitely go to the Bible there. And in fact, I have a little series called Global Weirding, and I'm going to put the link in here right now. It's on YouTube, and they're a series of very short videos. And one of the most popular videos I have is what does the Bible say about climate change? So here is Global Weirding. There we go. What I would say is, let's go to Genesis, where it says God gave humans responsibility over every living thing. Then let's go to Revelation, where it says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. Then let's go all the way through the Old Testament, where it talks about God's love and care for the most seemingly insignificant aspects of nature. Then let's go through the New Testament, where it says to care for the widows and the orphans and the poor. Wherever we go in the Bible, we see plenty of motivation to care for God's creation, for the plants, the animals, and our sisters and our brothers around the world. That's who God has made us to be. And in fact, that's why we're made in God's image. What are my best recommendations for maintaining open communication with deeply religious communities and individuals who have become consumed with mis and disinformation? Well, 10% of people in the US, and about the same amount in Canada, are what we call dismissive, which means they will dismiss anything. All the science, all the facts, even our Bible-based arguments. I think of dismissives as if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone appeared before them saying global warming is real, they would dismiss that. We all have an uncle, a neighbor, somebody at church who's bringing this up all the time, who's posting about it all the time on Facebook, who brings up in conversation all the time. That's usually a key that they're dismissive. And they're not wanting to hear a counter argument. They're just wanting to argue with somebody because it reinforces who they are and it reinforces their denial. So with someone like that, the 10% who are dismissive, and I have a global weirding video about that too, I say, I love you, you're wrong, and now let's talk about something else. But with the 90% who are not dismissive, I address their issue briefly, but then I move on to talking about a positive, constructive solution. And now many people say, well, how do you find these positive, constructive solutions? 2 years ago, I started a newsletter called Talking Climate. If you go to my website, which I'll put that right in here right now, www.katharineHayhoe.com, you can sign up for my newsletter. You can get it every week. It's called Talking Climate. I share good news about what is being done. I share not so good news about how climate change is affecting people and places and things we care about. And I share information on what we can do to make a difference every single week. So I share something that people could get excited about. Like the fact that, the last few weekends, 80% of the energy on the Texas grid has been wind or solar in Texas. Last summer, during our unprecedented heat waves, the fact that we were using so much wind and sun, which we don't pay for wind and sun, you pay for coal and gas and oil, but you don't pay for wind and sun, it was saving Texas electricity owners and households millions of dollars a day. Who couldn't get excited about that? I share solutions that people can get on board with so they realize it's not about making our lives worse, it's about making our lives and the lives of others better. And that's how we address these issues of solution aversion. Remember, when you talk about the heart and the hands, why it matters to where we live, why it matters to us, and what we can do about it that makes sense, that's good for us and good for others. So this is a great question here. How do you talk about it with people who deny the problem? You have to begin a conversation with what you have in common with people, not what divides you. And in fact, that's so important that I have an entire TED Talk about it. I'm not joking. My entire TED Talk answers your question. How do we begin with something that we have in common rather than what divides us? If you don't know what you have in common, you have to figure out what it is. And in fact, as I say in my book, I'll put my book up here too, because you might enjoy reading it. You could even buy it for your church library. As I say in my book, I've even started conversations over a shared love of knitting, or the fact that we both have kids, or we both live in Texas, or we both enjoy beach vacations. Start the conversation with something that we have in common, connect the dots to how climate change is affecting what we both care about, our kids, our food, the place we live, our beach vacations, and then bring up a positive, constructive solution that they could be like, oh, well, that makes sense. That's not destroying the economy. That's actually making my life better, not worse. That's actually improving our health or saving us money. Why wouldn't we do that? And you can find there's a lot more conversations you can have. Now, this presentation I gave was not my TED Talk. It was not my book. It was none of those, because those are out there and you can get them. So the natural place to go is to the TED Talk, the Global Weirding episodes, the book, and the newsletter, which is Talking Climate. Again, you can get it on my website, because those pick up exactly where we're leaving off right now, and they take you forward to the next step. I should also add that you can follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Facebook, LinkedIn, even TikTok. I'm not so good at that, but my cat's helping me. And that's where you can go a little further. So we are almost at time. And so I'm going to turn on my light here because we're getting a little dark, as you can see. And then, there we go. I'm going to do a speed round to end up. You see, we've gotten through quite a few questions, Brian. All right, speed round. Does evangelicalism bear some responsibility for the science denial? Evangelicalism in the United States does. Because whenever I find science denial outside the US in Christian circles, almost every single time, 9 out of 10 times, I can track it back to a US source. So The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind is a book that was, there we go, that was just re-released, and it is an excellent book explaining, I'm going to put it right here, explaining how Christians became increasingly associated with political ideology in the United States and how that has influenced our opinions on things that really should be guided by the Bible and by God's creation rather than by political ideology. Jane asks if you can get a copy of this presentation. Yes, it is recorded. You are going to get a copy of this video and you can share it with anyone you want. In fact, the more the better. All right. Is the carbon tax in Canada effective in combating climate change? Yes, it is. In fact, a new economic analysis that just came out, independent, not conducted by the government, showed that if the carbon tax was removed, it would actually economically harm middle and lower income Canadians more than leaving it in place, or more than, yes. So the carbon tax is the most effective way to send this signal to the economy that polluters pay. Most Canadians are actually benefiting from it, but it just hasn't been communicated. I don't feel as a Canadian that the benefits of the carbon tax have been clearly communicated to people. But it is working, it is making a difference, and if I could wave a magic wand and get one in the US, I would too. If you're interested in more, Citizens Climate Lobby is really good on explaining why a carbon tax would work in the US and how it would benefit people here as well. What simple actions do you recommend that we can each take individually, and is there time to fix this? I'm going to end with those two questions. So if you go to my social media feed, and I'm going to put the link in here for Threads, but you can go to a lot of my different social media accounts, you can see that the answer to what can I do as an individual is pinned to the top of my social media because it is so important. Number 1, use your voice. Number 2, join a climate action group and amplify your voice. Number 3, use your voice through where you keep your money, your bank, your credit card, your retirement. Number 4, use your voice at work and at school, and at church, I would add. Number 5, use your voice to hold politicians accountable, not just at the national level, but city, provincial, state. Number 6, reduce your personal carbon footprint and use your voice to make it contagious. That is the most important thing we can do, because what I know without a shadow of a doubt as a climate scientist who studies the future is that some amount of change is already inevitable. It's like we've been smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for years and decades, and there's some spots on our lungs, and we're not going to win the Olympic 100-meter dash anymore. But we don't have emphysema, we don't have lung cancer, and we're not dead. So when's the best time to stop smoking? As soon as possible. How much? As much as possible. As long as there is life, it is not too late. And I know that everything we do, individually and collectively, will alleviate some amount of future suffering for someone. And so that's why I fight. And that's why I encourage you to do so too, not out of fear, but out of love and a sound mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharine, for modeling for us how to have these kind of conversations. We need to bring this time together to a close. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for this event of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists. If you're interested in getting more information about the ACB or its parent organization, the American Scientific Affiliation, send us an email at asa@asa3.org. Again, that email address, asa@asa3.org. Let's close out our time together in prayer, and I'd like to ask Carl Pinkham, the Vice President of the ACB, to lead us in prayer.
Lord God Almighty, Creator of the universe, we thank you for the beauty and wonder of your creation. We especially thank you for giving us the task of being good stewards for that part of your creation found on earth. We confess that each of us has failed in minor ways and sometimes in major ways to meet that responsibility as you intended. Thank you for the clear message provided by Katharine Hayhoe this evening that our current planetary weather dilemma is of our own doing and needs our doing right to fix it. Give each of us insights into how we can, in minor and major ways, fulfill our responsibilities as stewards, right this wrong, and begin to use our voices effectively and responsibly. Bless all those who participated in this event tonight. Bless the American Scientific Affiliation and bless the affiliation of Christian biologists. Lord, we pray this all in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the three-in-one God. Amen.
Well, have a great evening, everyone. And we'll see you next month, hopefully. We have another event scheduled for May 14th, and you'll be hearing more about that soon. All right, take care.